As they left the ship again, and the gravity around them returned to, at least non-Deathworld normal level again, the three of them were surprised to walk almost right into Shida and Tuya, who seemed to have stopped in place right as they had reached the ramp's exit. And a brief look around quickly revealed what exactly had stopped them in their tracks, because they were facing another group of people that didn't stand far away from them, and looked like they had most likely waited here for all of their arrival. "If you're planning to arrest us, you should have brought more men," James announced, without so much as slowing his steps, as he joined up with the woman that had gone on ahead, now looking over at Reprieg, Fati, and Tshirt, who had seemingly caught up again after being banished from the earlier conversation by the captain. The group looked neither combat-ready nor heavily armed, so he suspected that they weren't actually here to try and arrest or otherwise hinder the human entourage on their way back to their ship, no matter how much they may have wanted to. The airlock to the dock was also wide open, meaning he had a clear view into the open space behind it, so he could see that there was no large security forces hiding in wait for them either. "I have seen what happens when we bring more force to stop you firsthand," Reprieg replied, and tapped the floor with his wooden crutch twice, pulling attention to it in the process. "Not that the diplomatic way has worked any better in the past, but at least it's kept my limbs intact." James scoffed through his teeth, while his people formed up around him. "A word then?" he asked, gesturing off to the side with his thumb while giving an appraising look to Reprieg's company. Reading Fati's expressionless face was obviously quite tricky, but he had learned to do it during his stay under her care, and she didn't look like she had much interest in talking to him at the moment. Tshirt, on the other hand, seemed to have a lot of things burning on his non-existent lips. However, something was clearly holding him back. He stood hunched, his feathers hanging limply, and he had trouble even looking at the human. Only Reprieg returned his gaze with a candid expression, seemingly earnestly interested in at least a brief exchange. Now the rodent nodded and started hobbling away from his company, waving for them to wait as he went on. James also turned in the same direction. However, before he took more than one step, he was stopped by a firm hand on his shoulder. Turning his head, he looked at the projection of Andrus' serious expression. Although he didn't see it, he knew the face underneath well enough to know exactly what he looked like now. The hard look in his scarlet eyes, the folds forming around his tightly pressed lips, and the wrinkles over his nose as his eyebrows moved tighter together. "You're sure about that?" he asked, clearly worried about his charge leaving with a known enemy like that. After all, the last time James and Reprieg had run off somewhere together, it hadn't ended well for either of them, with important body parts being lost on both sides. And he was still charged with James's protection, after all. Still, James gently lifted his hand away and smiled reassuringly. "I'm not all that worried," he said, putting his left hand onto the grip of the pistol on his hip, while lifting the right one to show it off in all its mechanical glory. Then he let it sink down again and put on a more empathizing expression. "Besides, I'll stay within sight. You can intervene at any time. If you want, you can come along as well, but it's probably going to be dreadfully boring." Andrus let out a long exhale and closed his eyes, letting his head sink for a second, but ultimately nodded and moved a step back, leaving James free to go. He looked around at everybody else. It seemed that Tuya and Athena had similar thoughts to that of the Major, but ultimately trusted James's judgment. Or at least they trusted that they could draw fast enough to intervene even at a slight distance, should it become necessary. "Do try to leave him in one piece this time, though," Admik commented, and clapped against James's arm with the back of his hand. "It's going to be really awkward explaining it away if you take the other leg off as well." James didn't exactly find that joke to be in the best taste. However, he was going to let it go this time, so he just hummed in acknowledgement and moved past. Then he briefly stopped in front of Shida. "Do you want to come?" he asked, and tilted his head slightly at her. Shida seemed to think for a moment, but then she clicked her lips annoyedly and averted her gaze. "If you take me along, you'll really have to worry about him leaving in one piece. I have nothing to say to him," she replied darkly at first. Then started to rotate her head in order to stretch her neck, rubbing her nape in the process. A bit more chippily, she then added, "Besides, I'm in a good mood right now, and I'm sure you don't want to ruin that before you have to share a room with me. You said it yourself. It's probably going to be dreadfully boring." James smiled and nodded, briefly letting his hand glide across the hair on her head and over her ears as he walked away, causing a brief chuff to escape her lips. Then he briskly walked over to where his fellow Deathworlder was waiting for him, all the way over at the wall of the dock, far away from any worker that might still be busy around them. Reprieg waited with both arms, leaned onto his crutch, and looked at him with big, dark eyes, while wriggling his trunk anticipatingly. The bushy end of his tail swept across the floor in even swings. "How is Dunamer this time of year?" the Sibberslang asked, as if they were old acquaintances. "I might have to go myself soon, and would like to prepare accordingly." James lifted his eyebrows. "Disgustingly hot and humid, with a sprinkle of deadly gravity," he replied with a shrug. "So, just the way you'd like it." The hot days on the core worlds were just as unforgotten in his mind as those recent ones on Dunamer. Reprieg chuckled and shook his head, making his trunk swing left to right slowly. "I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure what you're still hoping to get from talking to me at this point," James then said, getting to the meat of the conversation. He wasn't one for small talk, even with people he liked. At this point, you can't possibly think you'll still be able to sway me to change my mind. Reprieg's chuckling stopped, and he cleared his throat for a moment before he replied. "No, personally, I really am not that crazy," he admitted, which clearly implied that wasn't to say that there isn't anyone else out there who might still be crazy enough to believe that. No, to be completely honest, I'm quite glad I don't have to deal with you or any of your coterie anymore. He shifted slightly, taking one of his arms off the crutch and straightening his posture so he could look at James more heads-on, although he still had to look up a bit to meet with James's gaze. "But before I can have that peace of mind, I was hoping you'd answer some questions I have. As a sort of goodbye," he added, and briefly ran a hand across his trunk. "Questions, huh? Interesting." "That depends," James replied, and walked up to his old acquaintance to lean against the wall next to the Sibberslang. "Will you extend the same courtesy to me as well?" Reprieg sighed in an amused expression and shook his head slowly. "Not to the extent that you might want me to," he replied straight out, not even pretending that there was any chance James would be getting some precious information out of him. Not that James had much hope of that in the first place, but it was worth a try at least. Obviously he didn't plan on revealing anything that wasn't already publicly known either, and the fact that everything that they did was most likely recorded in more than one way urged them to remain civil and courteous. "What do you want to know?" James asked, without any more fanfare, turning his eyes away to look around the dock absent-mindedly. Reprieg was quiet for a moment longer, likely thinking through his formulation, while James watched the workers of the dock going about their labour. In the distance he could see that his own company and that of Reprieg had moved away from each other now, standing a good distance apart while shooting venomous glances at each other occasionally. Well, it was hard to tell with the masked humans, of course, and Tassil still seemed to have trouble keeping his eyes on the Deathworlders, so it was actually mostly Shida and Fati that glared across the distance every few seconds. "What do you want?" A question finally crossed Reprieg's lips, pulling James's attention back onto him. Although he had heard the question, he really didn't quite know what exactly Reprieg wanted from him. "I thought you wanted to ask questions," he said offhandedly, and glanced back at the man. "I am," Reprieg replied, and made a rolling gesture with his free hand. "And I'm asking you what you want. I mean, let's face it, you're not a politician. You're barely even an ambassador, and you hate being a soldier, you've told me yourself. So if you hate doing it, what do you get out of any of this? With Earth being as large as it is, I'm sure there's no shortage of any of the free, so why are you doing it? What keeps you going?" James took a deep breath and scratched his chin thoughtfully, after listening to the question thoroughly. "Well, I didn't really have a choice," he replied, trying to play the question off. "I still had contacts with the military, so when the Admiral came around, I had to..." It was interrupted by a sort of trumpeting sound coming from Reprieg that he had heard on a few occasions before. It was a sound of disparagement. "James, it just so happens that I know how you act when you're being forced to do something. We were part of the same crew, after all," Reprieg unsubtly reminded him with an implied wink, while simultaneously dismissing his explanation. "And while I believe that was what kept you around in the first place, it doesn't seem to me like someone is forcing you to be here, so there has to be something motivating you to keep going. I figured it'd have to be something you want." Well, if there would be someone who'd know what that'd look like, it'd be his mother. Reprieg was a close second, though. Seems like he wouldn't just be able to hand-wave the question away here. He ruminated for a second and looked to the ceiling as he thought. "Something I want, huh?" he mused, somewhat quietly. "Strange question coming from you, of all people." He could hear Reprieg shift and turned his head to look him in the eyes. "Or do you really not get it?" James asked, as the Deathworlders stared at each other. Reprieg's expression was one of confusion, and his trunk nervously twitched as he listened. "You're right. I hate doing this. Almost all of it. I've already had what I wanted. I had reached the point that I had worked towards since my childhood when I entered the GES for the first time. And I managed to leave this kind of life behind myself at that point as well. 18 years of study, going through hell and back for 3 years of military service, getting worked like a mule. All to finally get my own little lab, to do my own little studies in peace. Sure, there were still things I wanted to do, but they would have come along the way. I never had any delusions of grandeur. I never wanted to save the world or anything like that. I was content with doing my part to make it a little bit better. And with the big hurdles finally behind me, I was ready to enjoy the fruits of my labor for a bit. Finishing his monologue, his gaze hardened as he added, "Until you came along." Reprieg seemed to swallow heavily. It had been a while since James had the feeling that the Sipperslang was honestly even somewhat afraid of him. However, it seemed that his words may have struck a nerve, because old wounds looked to be opening up for Reprieg as he said them. Or maybe his glare had inadvertently become a bit more hateful than he had intended it to be. "Oh," Reprieg said hesitantly and cleared his throat. It looked like he couldn't really think of something to follow up on that. "And what about you?" James therefore asked, taking the work off him. "What's keeping you around?" Reprieg perked up in surprise. "Me?" he asked confusedly, lifting his trunk to almost point at James. "Yes," James answered. "It seems like you've been doing some thinking as well. You're not at all like you were back when we first met, and a lot has happened in the meantime, so why are you still doing any of this? A Deathworlder like yourself must have a reason to go along with all this madness, don't you?" Reprieg paused for a long moment. His expression turned dark and thoughtful, and he avoided James's gaze for a while. But ultimately, he scoffed with added disparagement. "What madness exactly are you talking about?" he asked almost mockingly, although there was doleful shimmer in his dark eyes as he spoke. It seemed like he wasn't going to slip up quite so easily. "The only mad one here is you." James exhaled slowly, but put on a slight smile. "Then I guess we have nothing more to discuss," he said, the smirk still on his face, and pushed himself away from the wall, immediately moving towards the others again. "If someone's giving you trouble on Dunima, be sure to have them call me. I made some contacts and would like to know who to put on my list of favourites. Goodbye, Reprieg." "I guess not," Reprieg replied, watching him as he left and also glancing over at the group of soldiers waiting for him. All of this was bigger than the lot of them. Yet they all had their reasons for being here today, and for none of them had it started only recently. Success to you, James. 6 years ago, in the South American jungles of Earth. The conversation in the room had stopped for a moment, as Admir had suddenly fallen into a coughing fit, bending over and desperately covering his mouth with his arm, as his lungs seemed to try to forcefully eject itself from his body, while James stood next to him and gently hit against his back to assist. "I know how to breathe," Admir hacked out between every few bouts of spasmic exhales, his voice strained from the tension still in his throat. "I promise." Yeah, Athena said from the other side of the room, where she leaned against the wall with her typical disinterested expression, like she couldn't be bothered to care about anything in the world. "Just try not to die before we even set out on our mission, okay?" James looked up at her annoyedly, while Admir slowly but surely got himself back under control. "Would it kill you to show a little compassion?" he asked grimly, and basically snarled at the blonde woman as he helped Admir to stand straight again. "We're supposed to look out for each other out here." Athena scoffed, but Admir used the opportunity to immediately get up in James's face. "Oh, you're the best, James," he said happily, and leaned in to try and steal a kiss. However, James was fast enough to quickly get his hand in between their faces, so Admir's lips hit his palm instead. "Whoa," James said, using the frosty gain leverage to push his boyfriend's face a good distance away from himself. "Slow down there, Tiger. I still don't want to catch whatever you have there." Admir laughed while he freed his face from James's hand. "It's called the gay James," he said, laughing so hard that he relapsed into another bit of coughing for a second, "and I'm pretty sure you already have it." He had to turn away again, because the costs were immediately returning with a vengeance from the strain. James rolled his eyes and returned to gently patting Admir's back. "Why are you the way that you are?" he asked, briefly leaning down to kiss the top of his head. "Shut up," Admir brought out between coughs. "You love me." James sighed, and in the corner of his vision he could see Athena make an exaggeratingly disgruntled face at their display of affection. Shortly after, the door flew open, and their team leader, Captain Andrus Kochukaru, walked in purposefully. His scarlet eyes scanned over the faces in the room, as everybody shot up straight and loudly greeted him as he arrived. Under his arm he carried a strange dark bundle of fabric. "At ease, everyone," he immediately dismissed them, and as they all relaxed, he took the bundle he was carrying into both arms, and started to rifle through the folds at its side with his fingers, seemingly separating it into multiple stacks. With forceful throws and without warning, he then tossed the individual stacks at each of them, leaving them to think fast and catch them as they hit against their bodies. James looked down at the thing or things he now held pressed against his chest with one arm, before letting it sink down slightly and unfolding it. "We got some new threats on mission control," Andrus explained, as everyone was slowly realizing what they were holding there. Specialized uniforms, likely designed for the jungle environment. "Hurry up and get dressed, then we can go get our equipment, and no shirts underneath." Without hesitation, the three soldiers immediately began unzipping and unbuttoning the jackets and pants of their uniforms, stripping down to their underwear and discarding the pieces of their old uniforms to the ground, before untangling the new pieces, and figuring out how exactly they had to put them on. The new uniforms consisted of a thin yet sturdy one-piece suit that adhered closely to the body and completely covered their arms and legs all the way up to the wrists and ankles, where they were tightly fastened directly at the joints, so the sleeves and legs wouldn't slip around. Then, over that, they had the usual pair of pants and a sturdy jacket, but made of a smooth polymer instead of the usual mixed fibre fabric. A single touch already told James that thorns and brambles would have a hard time getting through this clothing, and mud and dirt likely wouldn't stick to it very well. The colours were obviously adjusted to the forest floor, showing a mixture of venom greens and muddy browns. As they got dressed, James rolled his eyes as he noticed Admir's gaze sticking not only to him, but also to the admittedly well-formed shape of Athena's body, that to him was only a blur in the corner of his vision for a second. Leering at her in situations like this really wasn't a good way to instill any more confidence in her teammates into the woman. "All right," Andrus said, clapping his hands loudly to gain everyone's attention immediately. "The mission starts this evening, so you'll have a couple of hours to inspect the equipment. It's already been checked up and down by maintenance, of course, but you can never be too sure, so don't slack during the inspection. You already know the kind, but familiarize yourself with these specific ones. Knowing them in and out might save your life." Nothing they hadn't heard before, but constant repetition of anything and everything was a way of life in the military, so they were all used to hearing things over and over. "Yes, sir," they replied, synchronously. 6 years ago. Aboard the GES-32, currently docked at the Norsamani space station. "Ship and Shida reporting," the Armyat announced herself to the captain, with an enthusiastic salute. Captain Utong gave an amused chuckle. The large primate was standing up on his hind legs and briefly stroked down the fur on his chest to have a more put-together appearance. His dark eyes twinkled down at the much smaller Deathworlder before him. "That is Shida," he ordered leisurely, and calmly waved his hand downwards, indicating for her to relax. As soon as Shida dropped her salute, Utong leaned down, bringing his knuckles onto the floor and jumping his legs backwards so he could stand more comfortably on all four. Feeling unobserved as he settled down, Shida's eyes sneakily twitched over to the strange person that seemingly had awaited her together with the captain. She hadn't seen him on board before, so he had likely been picked up during this stop at the station. She recognized the species but couldn't put a name to it. She had just seen many statues and depictions of their people during her studies of textbooks around community history and important structures within the community. That meant they were a core worlder, much like the captain. Not only that, but he was a primate as well, smaller than the captain and much slimmer. Their arms were spindly and long, much longer than their legs, so they constantly touched the ground, although there was enough muscle definition on them to not make them appear frail. Their eyes were small and so slim that Shida could hardly look into them, but 4 ears, one on each corner of his head, were rotating individually and clearly studying her. Finally, after the captain had fully relaxed, the mystery person turned their head towards him. The dark fur on his body, but not that on his arms, was much longer than that of the captain, and it swung around wildly with each of their movements in the super-low gravity of the docked ship. "So, that's the apprentice you've been telling me about," he asked, briefly glancing over for a judgmental look at the feline. Utong clicked his tongue against his teeth in very mild disapproval. "Careful, Farfrak. She's not an apprentice anymore," the captain reprimanded him. "After her promotion, she's a fully fledged shipman now, and she'll fully take up that role once we depart from the station again." Farfrak made a devaluing noise and looked Shida up and down again. "And you really think someone like her will be a fitting addition to my team?" he asked, with surprisingly clear doubt in his voice, considering he was talking about a decision of the captain here. Shida awkwardly stepped in place, a bit of anxiety ramping up as she felt like she was being deliberately left out of this conversation that she had been personally invited to. Pent-up energy not quite willing to let itself be contained, she soon felt herself forced by her own body to quickly let out a slight cough, which would obviously pull attention towards her, despite her better judgment. She froze immediately in place when she noticed the rather depreciatory way with which this new primate was watching her restless legs shifting her weight around between each other, as well as her restlessly swinging tail. It was quite clear that she didn't pass muster in his eyes. Now that he was looking straight at her, she could more clearly see his identifier. It was one of their ship, so he clearly was here to stay and not just for a visit. And the badge fastened to it was one she saw rather rarely, but she still recognized. A warrant officer. Energetically, Captain Uton swung one of his enormous hands around and hit the man on the back with an encouraging pat that seemed to knock him off balance for the moment, making the spindly man look back at the captain with an annoyed glare. Shida knew these pats. She'd gotten her fair share from the captain during her years on the ship, and she knew that they really weren't disrupting enough to warrant such a reaction. "A perfect fit, I tell you," Uton chippily reassured the man, while he was getting his bearings again. The smaller primate clicked his tongue against his teeth, and brushed some of his fur into order with his long, slim fingers that were attached to what could barely be called a palm. "Well, all right then, sir," he said, sounding unconvinced, but clearly not wanting to antagonize his superior any more than he already had. "I will trust your judgment on this." Uton happily nodded his head at that. "Perfect!" he exclaimed, and quickly pushed his front off the ground so he could clap his meaty hands loudly. "Then I believe introductions are in order." Fully acknowledging her presence for the first time since their mutual greeting, Uton lifted a hand to gesture directly at Shida with a flatly outstretched palm. "Shipman Shida," he addressed the young feline, and his lips curled into a smile while he turned his arm almost 90 degrees to switch the focus of the conversation onto the second primate. "This is Warrant Officer Farvark Ruktusma. He and his team will be joining our ranks going forward, and he will also be taking over the part of your superior from Petty Officer Rezvai. He will guide you in the furthering of your career, and you will in turn reinforce his team with energetic support. Do as he says and don't make trouble for him, yes?" He then turned his gaze towards the warrant officer. "I'll be conferring her to your care," he said with a nod of his head, to which the warrant officer stood in salute, with Shida quickly doing the same. "Yes, sir," they both said loudly, and with that the captain turned to leave, leaving the both of them to slowly drop their stances. However, as Shida slowly settled into a relaxed posture again, she noticed the glimmering glare of her new superior drilling into the side of her head without any concealment, now that his own superior was gone, making her quickly shoot back into the salute, this time in his direction. As she stood there, stiff as a board, the two regarded each other with studious appraisal. He clearly still didn't think that Shida would be the best fit for his team, and quite honestly, the feeling was mutual. Shida didn't really know how to feel about being pawned off on someone who had just joined the crew that she'd been part of for years now, and that so shortly after her promotion. Actually, she knew exactly how she felt about it, but she also knew that she shouldn't let those feelings fully enter her conscience. This was military life. You either had to deal with it, or it wasn't for you. Just stay calm. This is an opportunity. Remembering his obvious disapproval of her nervous movement earlier, she forced herself to stand as still as she could, although she already felt energy building up within her again, begging to be released. "I guess I can work with this," the primate finally stated, and waved his long arm in a sign telling her to relax. Seemingly she had at least passed his first test by standing still, though despite that, she still made sure to not move her legs too much, even as she relaxed now. But her tail still swung around in anxious anticipation. She couldn't quite help that. "Shipman Shida," Warrant Officer Ruktusma then loudly announced, and saluted her for the first time. "From now on, you're under my watch." She had brought her legs together and stood straight. "Yes, sir." 6 years ago, on the great community station. "Can you imagine?" Prayer very asked, stretching her short arms in a big O while spreading out her fingers to signify something very big. "That whole thing, and he just jumped it." The lizard's black scales glimmered slightly in the dim light of the station, and her triangular face, ending in a snub snout, turned slightly to look up at Reprieg. The Citizen chuckled awkwardly and nervously wriggled his trunk. Yeah, crazy that, he mumbled, trying to play along with her excitement as she told the story. However, his memorable reply was completely drowned out by a much more booming voice chiming in as well. What do you mean, can you imagine? Caro thundered in a wild mixture of amusement and disparagement, his enormous nostrils flaring as he swung his head around. The dark tips of the bovine's thick horns glimmered just like Prevary's scales. He doesn't have to imagine, he can probably just do that. Reprieg exhaled briefly for his trunk. Caro wasn't wrong. In this gravity at least, jumps of quite impressive height and distance weren't really a problem for the Sipperslang. However, that didn't mean that he had to go around and shout it over the rooftops. At first, Prevary looked like she didn't know what the large ball was talking about. Then she suddenly lifted her head in immediate realization. Right, she said, her club tail swinging around and scraping across the ground briefly in an expression of embarrassment. I keep forgetting that you're from a Deathworld as well, Reprieg. Reprieg didn't exactly know how to reply, and he tried to play it off with a quick chuckle. Although he did feel the need to add, please don't call me that. He really didn't like his homeworld, Tshirt, to be regarded with that term. It didn't feel right when thinking about what kind of places that meant it would be compared to in turn. Why not? Caro, of course, immediately asked, disregarding, and lifted one of his hands off the ground for a second so he could gesture his dismissal of Reprieg's complaint with an open hand, while looking up with closed eyes. Wasn't the term literally coined for it? Reprieg cleared his throat. Yes, but that was a long time ago when Reprieg wanted to start. However, he was once again quickly drowned out again by the booming bovine. And you! Caro exclaimed, turning his attention to Prevary. The six-legged lizard's head flinched down in surprise, putting her arms down with it, since there was barely a neck in between the enormous head and the upper body. How come you just forget something like that? Has your species not developed long-term memory yet? Once she had recovered from the shock, the lizard's oxyan head shot up again to twinkle at Caro. I don't know, she retorted, clearly not finding her wits in time to actually come back with something clever instead. He's just so normal, it slips the mind. Reprieg sighed. We're core welders too, you know, he said, his voice finally becoming a bit louder as he felt his mood shift from meek to more a flutter. We help define what normal even is in the community. Yeah, Caro scoffed and shook his head, which made his pillowcase-like ears slap around with a disgusting noise. By being the first counterexample. Reprieg glared at him. The Sipperslang's contribution to the community's traditions went so much deeper than just being a first example of a species that fell out of order. They didn't even fall out of order. Much of their behaviour and culture aligned near perfectly with other core welders. The only difference was that their gravity was a bit higher. And besides, he was one to talk. Didn't the Shirlesh still have blood sports on their planets? Some Ustaf on the Perseus arm thinking he can lecture him on the community? The Sipperslang were already part of the community before the Shishlesh even knew alien life existed. But Reprieg didn't want to make the same mistake that had befallen Prevary earlier. If he wanted to get his point across, he would do so utterly convincingly. No weak retort would come out of his mouth. But while he was busy putting together just the right way to let the bovine know just how insignificant his species was in the galaxy as a whole, an unfamiliar voice suddenly joined in on the conversation. Or was it familiar? Reprieg couldn't help but feel like those melodious tones rang a bell somewhere in the back of his mind. While the Sipperslang came just short of being one of the community's founding members, it is undeniable that they still belong to its very foundation, the voice said, its owner having appeared seemingly out of nowhere right behind them. It sounded like the plucking of tight straps on an instrument. Without them, the Deathworlder term that you seemingly like to throw around with such an indignant tone wouldn't be the only thing we are missing in our daily lives. Looking just as surprised as Reprieg felt, both Prevary and Caro shot around, and they both had to look up at the new arrival. Reprieg, more of a master over his emotions, at least usually, turned slower and more prudently. Behind him stood a tall, stark white being, a large biped, although its feet split into 4 long parts at the end that served as a sort of additional pseudo-legs. The body was covered in thick ivory plates that showed a bark-like texture, with flowing forms and deep bridges to the outside. That was only interrupted at the joints and on the face, that was covered in a single, smooth plate. Out of that mask-like face looked 2 striking sky-blue eyes. A Colivri, not only a fellow core welder, but also one of the mentioned founders of the community. An incredibly old species that could date its history back an incredibly long time, somehow only rivaled by the Miat from Dunama, which was a Deathworld. A high-class one, unlike Tshirt. Although her features were utterly alien to him, without a face to identify, Reprieg felt like he had seen that person before. "And who asked you?" Borocaro then turned on her, having slowly recovered from the shock of her sudden appearance. Prevari remained silent. She had always had some troubles in the presence of much bigger species, especially if she didn't know the person very well. "Nobody," the mysterious Colvery said, and formed some of her many flexible arms into a shrugging motion. Clearly she was unimpressed. "I just heard the sound of ignorance and like to share enlightenment whenever I can. Did you, for example, know that Sibaslang invented the first high-speed shuttle engine, on the design of which we base our model to this day? Their imperviousness to high forces acting on their body allowed them to experiment with much more volatile accelerations at the early stages of their space days, which could afterwards be developed into a more controllable version. Fun, isn't it?" Borocaro was clearly still out to pick a fight with this strange woman. However, it seemed that her strange demeanour made it hard for him to think of something that would properly provoke her. The Colvery didn't give him the time of day, however. Instead, she leaned down so she could directly look into Reprieg's face. As she did so, a military identifier pinned with a badge that indicated a rank started to more loosely hang from her neck, and thus came into clearer view for Reprieg. A warrant officer? So, she was from the military as well. Quickly, Reprieg scrambled into a salute, only now realizing that he was dealing with a higher-ranking officer here. Her demeanour surely hadn't given away that much. "I was, however, asked to find a certain petty officer second-class Reprieg," she said, staring at Reprieg's own identifier that hung around his neck. "And it seems like I have found him. Good to see you again." Again? Had they met before? It was so hard to tell these people apart sometimes. When in his life had he interacted with a Colvery? A bell went off in the back of his mind. "You are Fati," he said in realization. "Back from the academy." Fati giggled, and it sounded like someone strumming across all strings of an instrument at once. "The very same," she said, confirming his suspicion. He remembered her now. She'd been a bit strange back then as well, but she was an ace in all her classes, and even in the physical training sessions she often had an edge over many others, despite the disadvantages the form of her own body often provided. Of course, he had still outperformed her at most physical turns, but that hardly counted in most people's eyes. "Good to see you're doing well. It's been a while." "That it has," Reprieg agreed awkwardly, not really knowing what to make of this interaction. "And why were you asked to look for me?" Fati reached around her body and opened a small bag that hung off her hips, pulling out a small white envelope that looked like nothing more than a stamp in her large hand. However, when Reprieg took it off her, it suddenly seemed to become normal-sized. "Your efforts have not gone unnoticed, and someone wants to make you an offer," Fati then said, while Reprieg still stared at the blank envelope. No receipt, no sender, just white. She then turned on the spot and immediately started to walk away. Although, before she left, she did order, "Open it in private. Success to you." "Success to you." Reprieg had just enough awareness to shout after her. Then she was already gone, and he stared at the envelope again. "What do you think it is?" Prevari perked up, standing up onto her strong hind legs to look at the item. Apparently she had immediately regained her courage as soon as the perceived threat had left. "No idea," Reprieg replied, licking over his trunk nervously. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Borocaro chimed in forcefully. "Open it." But Reprieg shook his head. He remembered Fati only vaguely, but something told him that her orders were not to be trifled with. His instincts made him feel all the eyes on him, and all the eyes that could potentially be on him at any moment all around. He would only be opening this once he felt not a single gaze on him.